Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome you to Season 1, Episode 1 of our brand new podcast entitled Simulation and Healthcare Education. My name is Dr. Jeffrey Barsick. I'm a professor of medicine and medical education at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. I currently serve as the Director of Simulation and Patient Safety. I would like to welcome you to the first podcast of a series on simulation and healthcare education. Throughout these podcasts, I will interview key players in healthcare education and get their unique perspectives on various topics germane to simulation education. Our first several podcasts will highlight key chapters from a book published by authors at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine called Comprehensive Healthcare Simulation, Mastery Learning and Health Professions Education. Today, I have the distinct honor of interviewing Dr. William McGahey. Dr. McGahey is a professor of medical education and preventive medicine at Northwestern, and in many circles is known as the godfather of simulation-based mastery learning. Bill, it's an honor to interview you today.
Thanks, Jeff. It's good to be on board with you today.
Bill, I've always been wondering a little bit about your background and journey. I've never really heard the whole story about where you came from and how you came up with the idea of mastery learning and combining it with simulation-based education and health professions. Can you enlighten us a little bit on that?
Well, I'll do my best. Actually, Jeff, my first encounter with mastery learning happened to me when I was an undergraduate college student. And I took a course in statistics that was taught using mastery learning principles. And it was a great experience, and everyone did very well. And I was impressed by that experience and wondered to myself why more college courses weren't being offered and presented using mastery principles, because it seemed so simple, so straightforward, and beneficial to all the students and even the faculty members. Later on, before I got into higher education, I taught high school for a year, and I became interested in using simulation technology, in that case, in teaching high school classes, and incorporating some mastery learning principles in a secondary school environment. I did that for about a year or so, and then came to Northwestern University as a graduate student in the early 1970s. And studied educational and social psychology, and always wondered, especially during my graduate school experience, why the mastery model was so esoteric and wasn't around. And have been tinkering with the idea of employing mastery learning principles in my own teaching for a long, long time. And having been in a number of different environments, my career first found me at the University of Illinois Medical Center in the late 1970s. In that environment, I was privileged to write a little book with George Miller and a couple of other colleagues having to do with competency-based education. That book was published by the World Health Organization, and it has a chapter devoted to mastery learning in a competency-based environment. Following my period at the University of Illinois, I then moved to the University of North Carolina. My career found me there basically during the decade of the 1980s, and I returned to Northwestern as a faculty member in the early 1990s, and have been a permanent member of the faculty basically ever since. And it's only through my involvement with you, Jeff Barsick, and our colleague Diane Wayne, that we were able to implement and study the utility of the mastery learning model in a clinical medical education context, basically for the past 15 years or so. This has been the focus of our attention, both as scientists and as teachers, as educators. And we've had what I regard to be really great success in introducing the mastery model to help chiefly, but not exclusively, residents acquire really important clinical skills to add to their clinical repertoires. And we learned a lot in terms of curriculum development, in terms of implementing these programs, in terms of doing research to document the outcomes of the mastery model, writing up our results, and so forth. The culmination of that work has been the publication early in 2020 of our textbook on mastery learning and health professions education that codifies a lot of this work and kind of sets the stage both for our continued program development as well as refining our research agenda as we move forward. So that's a capsule, a summary of my own career, my own interests in mastery learning over the past 3 or 4 decades up to the present, where we're just beginning to see the mastery model take off and get legs in environments other than Northwestern. Does that answer your question, Jeff?
Well, yes, I guess that gives a little bit of your background and how you got involved. But let's talk a little bit about when we got involved together, which is right at the beginning of this journey in simulation-based mastery learning, which was around 2004. You came up with the idea with Diane before I got on board of using mastery learning and simulation with advanced cardiac life support. I wanted to talk a little bit about your thoughts on that, the origins of clinical education, and how and why you came to the conclusion that based on the origins of clinical education and the fact that it wasn't working because there were uneven clinical and educational outcomes, why you chose mastery learning. And tell me a little bit about that first endeavor with advanced cardiac life support.
Well, I'll tell you a little story. Thanks for the opportunity to bring this up. I was working with Dr. Diane Wayne, who in those days was the program director for the internal medicine residency at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. And one of the requirements for all internal medicine residents, as well as many other health professionals, is to demonstrate fitness in responding to hospital codes. That is, healthcare providers are expected to be proficient in managing ACLS procedures, advanced cardiac life support procedures. And the typical approach had been to read up about how this is done and then take a weekend course sponsored by the American Heart Association that presumably conferred a fitness label on folks who had merely attended the weekend course. Well, it turned out that hospital nurses observed a number of resident teams responding to real code events in Northwestern Memorial Hospital. They reported to Dr. Wayne and myself that they observed that the way in which the residents were responding to these codes was really suboptimal and was very remote or distant from the minimum standards that were professed by the Heart Association. So that despite the fact that all of these individuals who are very bright and hardworking and they want to do well, despite the fact that they had been certified as being fit to respond to codes, their actual behavior during the code events in the hospital was far from what it should be. So this prompted Diane and I to, as well as a colleague, a respiratory therapist named Viva Sadal, who was around in those days, to begin to think about how we could improve the instruction and the readiness of residents in internal medicine to respond to hospital codes. That resulted in the creation of a clinical curriculum in responding to ACLS events, which we implemented. And we set up a simulation-based program to educate residents in the practical matters of responding to codes. The instructor for that curriculum in those days was Viva Sadal, a respiratory therapist who was just a great teacher in the simulation environment. And our first endeavor was not a mastery program, but we did a randomized trial to see if the new curriculum that we imposed would increase the skill set of the residents that we were working with in those days. We set up a randomized trial with a wait list control condition, which meant that we could study the impact of the intervention under circumstances where we couldn't teach everybody simultaneously, but we didn't want to withhold the intervention from any of our learners. Bottom line is that we discovered that the simulation-based curriculum in ACLS was remarkably successful in boosting the skill sets of the learners who were exposed to the curriculum. And oh, by the way, as a collateral effect, the residents loved it. They had a wonderful time. working very hard in the simulation environment to acquire this skill set. And they loved it because they realized that as a consequence, they were much better doctors. It boosted their morale. They had a great feeling of accomplishment. And it led us to conclude that we've got to amplify this kind of training, not only because it makes people more skillful as physicians, as healthcare providers, but also because it boosts morale. As a second thought, we did a follow-up study on these folks who had taken the ACLS curriculum, and we discovered that their skills did indeed transfer to the hospital environment in terms of responding to real codes. And we discovered that residents who were trained under this rigorous environment responded to codes in a much more favorable manner than their peers who had not been simulation trained. So we demonstrated effects in the simulation laboratory, and we demonstrated that those effects paid off in terms of response to real codes. And it led us to believe that we have to do a better job, an even better job in our teaching. And that's what led us to the mastery learning model, which was kind of stage 2 after we demonstrated the feasibility of the simulation-based education in the laboratory. So that's the origins of the work we did. And from that point on, all of the education and research studies that I worked with Diane and her team, and you joined us shortly thereafter, employed the mastery learning model because we reached the conclusion that the usual approach to clinical education, where good enough is deemed to be good enough, didn't suit our standards. And we came to the conclusion very quickly that we wanted to educate all of the internal medicine residents to a very, very high standard of achievement without exception. And we would not accept anything less than excellence. And that's been the mantra ever since. We've endorsed the idea that mastery learning involves excellence for all. And we educate residents, nurses, many, many other healthcare providers to very high standards in the simulation laboratory. In many studies we've done following up their skill sets in real intervention or in real clinical environments leads us to conclude that there are payoffs downstream in terms of better patient care practices and even patient outcomes. So there you have it. That in a nutshell is what we've done in terms of mastery learning. Jeff?
Yeah. So, Bill, that is great. That tells me a little bit about the beginning of mastery learning and how it was done. Can you talk a little bit for the people that are younger like me about the origins of clinical education and how it developed over time to where we are now with using simulation and competency-based education?
Okay, Jeff, I'll do my best in a nutshell. The clinical education model that is widespread today in the United States and elsewhere around the world is grounded in principles that were originated by a gentleman named Sir William Osler, who was the first professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins in the 1890s. And from his work, which, by the way, is published in a book called Equinematis, there's a chapter in that book called The Hospital as a College, published, I think, in 1903. That chapter sets forth the principles of what we know now today as the clinical clerkship, which in those days and even today means that the curriculum is embodied in patients. And that the idea is that exposure to a variety of patients in the clinical environment and taking care of patients, sometimes under supervision, often not, was sufficient as an education intervention to prepare people, mostly doctors in those days, to render patient care and do so safely and effectively. The clinical education model that Osler provided for us is very passive in terms of the education involvement. And it assumes that exposure alone, with no feedback, no rigorous education, no repetition, and so forth, was enough. And in those days, it represented the best of 19th century thinking. The problem is that we're now in the 21st century, and we know a lot more about how to design education environments and how to evaluate results and use